Picture this. A quiet transfer student sits alone during lunch, minding her own business, when suddenly she's surrounded by the school's most ruthless bullies. They think they found the perfect victim, someone with no friends, no connections, no power. What they don't realize is that this seemingly helpless girl has been raised by one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Her mother doesn't just work for the FBI, she runs it. And when these bullies push too far, they're about to discover that some people have resources they never imagined. This is a story about hidden strength, calculated justice, and what happens when you mess with the wrong family. Get ready for a tale of revenge so perfectly executed, it'll leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had been staring at the same page of her chemistry textbook for 20 minutes, but the words kept blurring together. The cafeteria noise around her felt like white noise, a constant hum of conversations she wasn't part of. 3 weeks into her junior year at Oakwood High School, and she still felt like a ghost drifting through the hallways. Moving from Washington, D.C. to Millbrook, Connecticut had been harder than she'd anticipated, even though she'd done this dance before. Military families moved frequently, but her mother's career with the FBI had taken them to a different kind of nomadic lifestyle, one where Emma had learned to keep her family's business private and her own head down. The September afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the school's main commons area, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Oakwood High was the kind of place that appeared in college brochures, gleaming hallways, state-of-the-art facilities, and students who looked like they'd stepped out of a catalog. Emma's previous school in D.C. had been grittier, more diverse, and somehow more honest about what it was. Here, everything felt performed, as if everyone was playing a role in some elaborate production. Emma closed her textbook and glanced around the commons. Students clustered in their established groups, the theater kids near the stage area, the athletes by the trophy cases, the academic overachievers at the tables closest to the library entrance. And then there was the group that seemed to command attention wherever they went, the ones who moved through the school like they owned it. Emma had noticed them on her first day, mainly because they were impossible to ignore. Madison Clark was their undisputed leader, a tall blonde with perfectly styled hair and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. She dressed like she was heading to a photo shoot rather than chemistry class, and somehow managed to make the school's standard-issue polo shirt look like designer wear. Emma had heard other students refer to her as Mad Queen Madison when they thought she couldn't hear, a nickname that seemed to capture both her authority and her temperament. Connor Walsh was Madison's right hand, a broad-shouldered lacrosse player whose family had apparently donated enough money to get a wing of the school named after them. He had the easy charm of someone who'd never faced real consequences, and Emma had watched him smooth-talk his way out of trouble with teachers more than once. His smile was weapon-grade, the kind that made adults forget what they were angry about. Sophia Bennett completed their inner circle, a petite brunette whose innocent appearance masked what Emma suspected was a razor-sharp mind for social manipulation. She was always on her phone, documenting every moment of their lives for social media, but Emma had noticed how carefully she curated each post, how strategic each photo seemed to be. The fourth member of their group was Ryan Miller, who seemed to exist in their orbit without quite belonging to it. He was quieter than the others, more observant, and Emma got the sense that he was there because he knew where the bodies were buried rather than because he was truly accepted. There was something nervous about him, the way he constantly looked around as if expecting trouble. Emma had been careful to stay off their radar, which hadn't been difficult since she seemed to be invisible to most of the school anyway. She kept to herself, did her work, and tried to blend into the background. It was a survival strategy she'd perfected over the years, and it had served her well in the past. But Oakwood High felt different somehow, like the social dynamics were more rigid, more unforgiving. She was packing up her things when she felt someone's presence behind her. Emma turned to find Madison Clark standing there, flanked by Connor and Sophia. Ryan hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. "You're the new girl, right?" Madison's voice was sweet, but there was something cold underneath it, like sugar poured over ice. "Emma something?" "Rodriguez," Emma replied quietly, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She could feel other students starting to notice the interaction, conversations quieting as people turned to watch. "Right, Rodriguez." Madison smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've been meaning to talk to you. See, we have this thing here at Oakwood where we like to help new students understand how things work. It's kind of a public service. Connor stepped forward slightly, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Emma's table. Yeah, we wouldn't want you to accidentally step on any toes. You know? Some people here have been working really hard to maintain certain standards. Emma felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd gotten in D.C. when she'd found herself on the wrong side of the wrong people. But this felt different, more calculated. These weren't street kids acting on impulse. These were privileged teenagers who'd learned that their actions rarely had consequences. I'm not looking for any trouble, Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. I just want to get through the year. Sophia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, sweetie, trouble isn't something you look for. Sometimes it just finds you. She held up her phone, and Emma realized she'd been recording the entire conversation. Especially when you don't understand your place. The Commons had gone almost completely quiet now, with students pretending to study while actually watching the drama unfold. Emma could feel dozens of eyes on her, and she knew that whatever happened next would be all over social media within the hour. She'd seen this before, the way a single moment could define someone's entire high school experience. What exactly is my place? Emma asked, surprising herself with the question. She'd meant to just walk away, to avoid confrontation, but something about their smugness had gotten under her skin. Madison's smile widened, and Emma realized she'd just given her exactly what she wanted. Well, that depends on you, doesn't it? See, Oakwood has a certain reputation to maintain. Our families have been part of this community for generations. We know how things work here, what's expected, what's acceptable. She paused, letting her words sink in. And sometimes, people who don't understand that can make things difficult for everyone. Connor nodded along like he was providing backup vocals to Madison's lead. It's nothing personal, really. It's just that some people fit in here and others don't. Better to figure that out early, don't you think? Emma looked around the Commons, at all the students who were pretending not to watch while hanging on every word. She thought about her mother, who'd taught her that bullies were just cowards with better marketing. She thought about all the times she'd moved schools, all the times she'd had to start over, all the times she'd chosen to keep her head down and wait for things to blow over. And if I don't fit in? Emma asked quietly. Sophia stopped recording and looked up from her phone with genuine interest, as if Emma had just asked a particularly fascinating question. Well, then you might find that Oakwood can be a pretty lonely place. People talk, you know. Word gets around about who's worth knowing and who isn't. And once that happens... She shrugged, as if the outcome was inevitable. Emma felt something shift inside her, a quiet click like a lock turning. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to blend in, trying to be invisible, trying to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. But looking at Madison's perfectly arranged smile, at Connor's casual arrogance, at Sophia's calculated cruelty, she realized that invisibility wasn't protection. It was just another form of surrender. I see, Emma said, her voice steady now. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to explain how things work here. Really, I do. It's always helpful to understand the local ecosystem. Something in her tone must have registered because Madison's smile faltered slightly. Excuse me? The ecosystem, Emma repeated. You know, predators, prey, scavengers. The food chain. It's fascinating how it plays out in different environments. She adjusted her backpack and looked directly at Madison. Thanks for the education. Emma turned to walk away, but Connor stepped into her path. Hold on there, new girl. I don't think you're understanding what we're trying to tell you. Oh, I understand perfectly, Emma said, looking up at him without flinching. You're trying to establish dominance through intimidation. It's a pretty standard approach, actually. Textbook stuff. The Commons had gone completely silent now. Even the students who'd been pretending not to listen were openly staring. Emma could see teachers starting to notice the commotion from across the room, but they were too far away to hear what was being said. Madison's face had gone pale, except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. You think you're smart, don't you? Coming in here with your attitude, Acting like you're better than everyone else? I don't think I'm better than anyone, Emma said calmly. I just think I'm different than you expected. Sophia had started recording again, her eyes bright with excitement. This is so going on my story, she whispered to Connor, who was still blocking Emma's path. Maybe you need a more detailed explanation, Connor said, stepping closer. See, my family's been in Millbrook for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built half this town. My dad's on the school board. And when I tell people that someone's not Oakwood material, they listen. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That's impressive, really. 4 generations of influence is nothing to take lightly. She paused, meeting his eyes. My family's a little different, though. We tend to think in terms of jurisdiction rather than generations. Jurisdiction? Madison repeated, the word coming out like a question. It's a legal term, Emma explained helpfully. It refers to the official power to make legal decisions and judgments. Like, for example, federal jurisdiction usually trumps local jurisdiction. It's a hierarchy thing. Ryan, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. He tugged on Connor's sleeve. Maybe we should just... Shut up, Ryan, Madison snapped, not taking her eyes off Emma. What are you talking about, jurisdiction? This is a high school, not a courtroom. Emma smiled for the first time since the conversation had started. You're absolutely right. This is a high school. But the thing about jurisdiction is that it doesn't really care about location. It's more about authority. She adjusted her backpack again. Anyway, I should probably get to class. Chemistry waits for no one. She stepped around Connor, who was too surprised to stop her, and headed toward the hallway. Behind her, she could hear Madison's voice rising in frustration. This isn't over, Madison called after her. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Emma paused at the entrance to the Commons and turned back. Actually, I think I have a pretty good idea. The question is whether you know who you're dealing with. She smiled again, and this time there was something different about it, something that made Madison take a step back. See you around, Madison. As Emma walked toward her chemistry class, she could hear the explosion of conversation behind her. By the time she reached Mr. Peterson's classroom, her phone was already buzzing with notifications. Someone had posted Sophia's video, and apparently, it was already making the rounds.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Emma silenced her phone and took her seat in the back of the classroom. She'd learned a long time ago that the first confrontation was never the real battle. It was just the opening move. And in chess, as her mother had taught her, the player who thinks 3 moves ahead usually wins. As Mr. Peterson began his lecture on molecular structures, Emma found herself thinking about ecosystems again. Madison was right about one thing. Every environment had its own food chain, its own balance of power. But what Madison didn't understand was that Emma hadn't come to Oakwood to find her place in their ecosystem. She'd come to study it. And now that she understood how it worked, she could begin to figure out how to change it. The thought made her smile. And for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Emma Rodriguez felt like she might actually enjoy her time at Oakwood High School after all. The chemistry lab felt different when Emma arrived the next morning. Students who had previously ignored her existence were now stealing glances, whispering behind their hands, and quickly looking away when she caught them staring. The video of her confrontation with Madison had apparently made quite the impression, though Emma suspected not everyone was sure what to make of it yet. She settled into her usual seat at the back of the room, pulling out her notebook and trying to project an air of normalcy. But normalcy, she was learning, was a luxury she might not be able to afford much longer. The ecosystem at Oakwood High had been disturbed, and, like any disrupted environment, it was beginning to react in unpredictable ways. Mr. Peterson was setting up an experiment involving chemical reactions when the classroom door opened. Madison Clark walked in, flanked as always by her inner circle, but there was something different about her demeanor today. Gone was the casual confidence from yesterday's encounter. Instead, there was a sharpness to her movements, a tension that suggested yesterday's public confrontation had not gone according to plan. Emma watched as Madison's eyes swept the classroom, finally landing on her with an intensity that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably in their seats. The message was clear. This wasn't over. If anything, Emma's refusal to back down had escalated things to a new level. "Miss Clark, please take your seat," Mr. Peterson called, without looking up from his demonstration setup. "We're about to begin today's lab on catalytic reactions." Madison slid into a seat 3 rows ahead of Emma, but not before making sure their eyes met one more time. Connor and Sophia flanked her on either side, while Ryan took a seat slightly apart from the group, his usual position of proximity without full inclusion. As Mr. Peterson began explaining the day's experiment, Emma found herself studying the dynamics of Madison's group with new interest. Yesterday's confrontation had given her a clearer picture of how they operated, and more importantly, how they might be vulnerable. Madison was clearly the strategic center of their operation, the one who made decisions and set targets. Connor provided muscle and intimidation, using his size and family connections to enforce Madison's will. Sophia handled the social warfare, documentation, rumor spreading, digital assassination. But Ryan was the interesting one. Emma had noticed his discomfort during yesterday's confrontation, the way he'd tried to de-escalate the situation. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with the others, a reluctance that suggested he might be there more out of necessity than genuine allegiance. "Today we'll be working in pairs," Mr. Peterson announced, causing a ripple of movement through the classroom as students began eyeing potential partners. "I'll be assigning the partnerships to ensure a good mix of skill levels." Emma felt a small spike of anxiety. Group work meant forced interaction, and given yesterday's events, she suspected Madison's crew would find a way to make this uncomfortable for her, regardless of who she was paired with. "Rodriguez and Miller," Mr. Peterson called out, consulting his list. Emma looked up to see Ryan's face go pale. He glanced nervously toward Madison, who was staring at him with an expression that could have frozen nitrogen. Emma gathered her materials and moved to the lab station where Ryan was already setting up, his hands moving with jerky, nervous energy. She could feel Madison's eyes burning into them from across the room, and she suspected this partnership was about to become very complicated for Ryan Miller. "So," Emma said quietly as she arranged her safety equipment, "this should be interesting." Ryan didn't respond immediately, focusing intently on reading the experiment instructions as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Finally, he glanced up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look, about yesterday." "You tried to get Connor to back off," Emma observed. "Why?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He fumbled with a beaker, nearly dropping it before setting it carefully on the lab bench. Things were getting intense, that's all." Emma studied his face as she measured out their first chemical sample. Ryan Miller was an interesting puzzle. He had the same expensive clothes as the others, the same carefully maintained appearance, but there was something haunted about his eyes, something that spoke of pressure rather than privilege. "How long have you been part of their group?" she asked, keeping her voice conversational as she added the first reagent to their mixture. "Since freshman year," Ryan replied automatically, then looked surprised that he'd answered so readily. He glanced around nervously, as if Madison might somehow overhear their conversation despite being across the room. "That's a long time," Emma mused, watching the solution begin to change color. "Must be nice, having that kind of social security." Ryan's laugh was bitter and short. "Yeah, security. That's one word for it." There was something in his tone that made Emma look at him more closely. She was beginning to understand that Ryan Miller's position in Madison's group might not be as voluntary as it appeared from the outside. "Your turn to add the catalyst," she said, handing him the small vial of clear liquid. As he took it, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Ryan paused, the vial halfway to the beaker. For a moment, Emma thought he might actually open up, might say something real. But then his eyes flicked toward Madison Station, and his face shuddered, closed again. "I'm fine," he said, adding the catalyst with practiced precision. "Just focused on the experiment." They worked in silence for a few minutes, following the procedure and recording their observations. But Emma could feel the tension radiating from Ryan like heat from a furnace. Whatever hold Madison's group had over him, it was strong enough to keep him terrified even in the relative safety of a supervised classroom. You know, Emma said as they waited for their final reaction to complete, I moved around a lot when I was younger. Military family. You learn to spot certain patterns when you've seen enough different social environments. Ryan didn't respond, but she could see he was listening. There are always alphas and followers, predators and prey. But sometimes there are people caught in between. People who aren't really predators but can't afford to be prey either. She made a note in her lab book, her voice casual. Those people usually have the most interesting stories. Ryan's pen stopped moving across his paper. When he looked up, there was something desperate in his eyes, as if he was drowning and she'd just thrown him a rope he couldn't quite reach. You don't understand, he whispered. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Madison doesn't just ruin people here, she destroys them. And she has resources you can't imagine. Emma felt a chill run down her spine, not because she was afraid, but because she was beginning to understand the true scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just typical high school bullying. This was something more systematic, more calculated. What kind of resources? She asked quietly. Before Ryan could answer, Mr. Peterson called for everyone's attention. Time's up. Please clean your stations and record your final observations. Lab reports are due tomorrow. As they cleaned their equipment, Ryan seemed to shrink back into himself, the moment of openness closing like a door slamming shut. But Emma had seen enough to know that Ryan Miller was not just a willing participant in Madison's games. He was another victim, one who'd found a way to survive by becoming useful to his tormentors. The bell rang, and students began filing out of the classroom. As Emma packed her things, she noticed Madison approaching their station. Ryan's face went pale, and he suddenly became very busy organizing his already organized notebook. Ryan? Madison's voice was sweet, but there was steel underneath it. I need to talk to you. Walk with me to lunch. It wasn't a request. Ryan nodded quickly, shoving his materials into his backpack with shaking hands. As they prepared to leave, Madison turned to Emma with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Nice lab work today, Emma. I hope you learned something interesting. The words were innocent enough, but the threat was clear. Madison knew that Ryan had been talking to Emma, and she was making sure both of them understood that she was watching. After they left, Emma remained at the lab station for a moment, thinking. She pulled out her phone and opened a new note, typing quickly, Ryan Miller, leverage, not loyalty. Madison's resources, investigate. Pattern suggests institutional backing. As she walked toward the cafeteria, Emma found herself thinking about power structures and how they maintain themselves. Madison's confidence wasn't just teenage arrogance. It was the assurance of someone who knew the system would protect her. But every system had weaknesses, and Emma was beginning to form a theory about where Madison's true strength came from. The cafeteria was buzzing with conversation when Emma arrived, and she didn't need to strain her ears to know what topic was dominating the lunch hour. Yesterday's confrontation had clearly become the talk of the school, with various versions of the story circulating like wildfire. Emma bought her lunch and found an empty table near the windows, a position that gave her a clear view of most of the cafeteria while keeping her back protected. It was a habit her mother had taught her. Always know your exits. Always maintain situational awareness. As she ate, she observed the social dynamics playing out around her. Madison's table was the clear center of attention, with other students constantly glancing in their direction and several groups sending emissaries to pay their respects. It was like watching a medieval court, complete with hierarchies, alliances, and subtle displays of power. But Emma also noticed something else. There were students who kept their distance from Madison's table, who seemed to watch the proceedings with barely concealed resentment or fear. Not everyone at Oakwood High was willing to bow to Madison's authority, but they were smart enough to keep their dissent quiet. One of those students was Jessica Park, a girl Emma had noticed in her English class. Jessica was the editor of the school newspaper, a position that should have given her some social standing, but Emma had observed that she was largely ignored by the popular crowd. Now, watching Jessica eat alone while occasionally glancing toward Madison's table with something that looked like calculation, Emma wondered if she might have found a potential ally. Emma finished her lunch and was preparing to leave when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me in the library after school. 3rd floor, back corner. Come alone. J." She looked around the cafeteria until she spotted Jessica Park, who was now staring directly at her. When their eyes met, Jessica gave an almost imperceptible nod before looking away. Interesting. It seemed Emma wasn't the only one at Oakwood High who was paying attention to patterns and power structures. The question was what Jessica Park wanted, and whether she could be trusted. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of sideways glances and whispered conversations. Emma could feel the weight of attention on her wherever she went, the sense that everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. By the time the final bell rang, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma made her way to the library, a 3-story building that connected to the main school through a covered walkway. The first 2 floors were buzzing with students working on homework and group projects, but the 3rd floor was quieter, reserved for serious studying and research. She found Jessica Park exactly where she'd indicated, sitting at a table in the far corner surrounded by stacks of newspapers and printouts. Jessica looked up as Emma approached, her expression serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thank you for coming," Jessica said quietly, gesturing for Emma to sit. "I wasn't sure you would." Emma settled into the chair across from her, noting that Jessica had chosen a spot where their conversation would be difficult to overhear and impossible to approach without being seen. "Your text was intriguing. Not many people here seem interested in having private conversations with the new girl." Jessica smiled grimly. "Not many people here are interested in the truth about Madison Clark and her friends. But I am." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've been watching you since you arrived, Emma, the way you handle yourself, the way you observe people. You're not just another transfer student, are you?" Emma studied Jessica's face, trying to read her intentions. "What makes you say that?" "Yesterday's confrontation, for one thing. Most people faced with Madison's particular brand of intimidation either crumble immediately or come back swinging wild. You did neither. You were calm, strategic, almost like you were conducting an interview rather than being threatened." Jessica paused. "That's not normal teenage behavior." Emma felt a spike of concern. If Jessica had picked up on something unusual about her responses, others might have too. "Maybe I'm just good at staying calm under pressure." "Maybe," Jessica agreed. "Or maybe you've had training in dealing with hostile situations." Professional training. The words hung in the air between them, and Emma realized that Jessica Park was far more perceptive than she'd given her credit for. The question was how much she actually knew, and what she planned to do with her suspicions. "Let's say, hypothetically, that you're right," Emma said carefully. "What would you want with that information?" Jessica leaned back in her chair, a satisfied expression crossing her face. "I want to bring down Madison Clark and her entire operation, and I think you might be exactly the person who can help me do it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the table between them. "I've been investigating Madison's group for 2 years, documenting their activities, building cases. But every time I get close to exposing them, something happens. Evidence disappears. Witnesses change their stories. Sources dry up." Emma looked at the folder with interest. "That suggests institutional protection." "Exactly." Jessica's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of finding someone who understood the implications. Madison's father isn't just wealthy. He's connected. He sits on the school board, contributes heavily to local political campaigns, and has business relationships with half the power brokers in Connecticut. When Madison gets in trouble, it just goes away. Emma felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Madison's confidence wasn't just teenage arrogance. It was the assurance of someone who'd never faced real consequences because the system was designed to protect her. "What kind of activities are we talking about?" Emma asked. Jessica opened the folder and began spreading out documents. "Academic fraud, for starters. Madison's been running a sophisticated cheating operation for years. Buying test answers, having other students write her papers, even having her homework completed by private tutors her father pays under the table." She pulled out a series of photographs showing students exchanging papers and looking at phone screens during tests. Then there's the harassment campaigns. Systematic bullying designed to drive specific students out of the school. They target kids whose parents don't have the resources or connections to fight back. Emma studied the photos, noting the methodical way the evidence had been collected. Jessica Park was clearly more than just a school newspaper editor. She was an investigator. "There's more," Jessica continued, pulling out printouts of social media posts and text message screenshots. Cyberbullying, digital stalking, even some evidence of blackmail. They use social media to destroy reputations, spread false rumors, and isolate their targets. Emma looked up from the documents. "This is extensive, professional-level investigation. How did you—" "My mother's a private investigator," Jessica said simply. "She taught me how to document evidence, how to build cases. I've been applying those skills to Madison's group because someone needs to hold them accountable." Emma felt a surge of respect for Jessica Park. Here was someone who'd recognized a problem and had taken concrete steps to address it, despite the personal risk. It was the kind of principled action her mother had taught her to admire. "The problem is," Jessica continued, "I don't have the resources to fight the kind of institutional protection Madison enjoys. Every time I try to bring this evidence to school administrators, it gets buried. The local police won't touch it because of her father's connections. And the state authorities don't consider high school bullying a priority." Emma was beginning to understand why Jessica had approached her. "You think I might have access to different resources. I think you might have access to people who can't be bought or intimidated by a small-town businessman with delusions of grandeur." Jessica's eyes were intense behind her glasses. "Am I wrong?" Emma considered her options. Revealing her family background would be a significant risk, but Jessica had already demonstrated both competence and discretion. And the evidence Jessica had compiled was compelling. This wasn't just typical teenage drama, but a pattern of criminal behavior that was being systematically covered up. "Let's say you're not wrong," Emma said finally. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jessica smiled, and for the first time since Emma had met her, she looked genuinely hopeful. "I'm proposing we work together to expose Madison's operation in a way that can't be buried or ignored. But to do that, I need someone with connections that go beyond Millbrook's local power structure." Emma looked at the evidence spread across the table, thinking about justice and jurisdiction, about the difference between local influence and federal authority. Madison Clark might have her father's protection in Millbrook, but corruption and racketeering were federal crimes. And systematic harassment that crossed state lines through digital platforms fell under federal jurisdiction. "I might be able to help," Emma said carefully, "but if we do this, we do it right. Professional standards, bulletproof evidence, everything by the book." Jessica's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." As they began organizing the documents and planning their next steps, Emma felt a familiar sensation, the quiet satisfaction of a mission beginning to take shape. Madison Clark had made the mistake of thinking that power was about who you knew in your small corner of the world. She was about to learn that some people's corners were considerably larger than others. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the library windows as Emma and Jessica worked through the evidence, organizing it into categories and identifying gaps that needed to be filled. Emma found herself impressed by the thoroughness of Jessica's documentation, but also concerned by some of the patterns she was seeing. "This harassment campaign against Sarah Martinez," Emma said, pointing to a series of screenshots showing increasingly vicious social media attacks. "What happened to her?" Jessica's expression darkened. She transferred to a private school in Hartford after Christmas last year. The bullying got so bad she was having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, stopped eating. Her parents finally pulled her out when she— Jessica paused, her voice catching slightly. "When she tried to hurt herself." Emma felt a cold anger settling in her chest. This wasn't just teenage cruelty. This was systematic psychological warfare with real casualties. "Do you have contact information for her family?" "Some." "Why?" "Because if we're going to build a case, we need victims willing to testify. And if Sarah Martinez was driven to self-harm by Madison's actions, that escalates this from harassment to something much more serious." Jessica nodded, making a note. "There are others, too. At least 6 students who've transferred out in the past 2 years after being targeted by Madison's group. The school administration calls it normal attrition, but the pattern is pretty clear when you look at the data." Emma was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a single incident of bullying. It was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been systematically destroying lives while hiding behind institutional protection. "We need to be careful about how we approach this," Emma said. "If Madison's father really does have the kind of connections you're describing, they'll know we're investigating long before we're ready to move. We need to keep this completely compartmentalized until we have everything we need." "Agreed. I've been working alone for exactly that reason." Jessica paused, studying Emma's face. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Yesterday, when Madison was threatening you, you mentioned jurisdiction and authority. You talked like someone who really understands how power works, not just theoretically, but practically." Jessica leaned forward. "Who exactly is your family, Emma?" Emma met her gaze steadily. If they were going to work together, Jessica deserved to know what she was getting into. And more importantly, she deserved to understand the resources they would have access to. "My mother is Director Maria Rodriguez," Emma said quietly. "She runs the FBI." Jessica's eyes went wide, and for a moment she just stared. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, Madison has no idea what she stepped in, does she?" "Not yet," Emma agreed. "But she's about to find out." The silence in the library stretched for several long moments as Jessica processed what Emma had just revealed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, tinged with a mixture of awe and vindication. "The FBI director," Jessica repeated as if testing the words. "Your mother runs the entire Federal Bureau of Investigation." Emma nodded, watching Jessica's face carefully for any sign that this revelation might be too much for her to handle. Some people became intimidated when they learned about her family's position, treating her differently, as if she were suddenly made of glass or dynamite. Others became overeager, seeing opportunity rather than partnership. But Jessica's reaction was different. After the initial shock wore off, her expression settled into something that looked like grim satisfaction. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "It means we have resources," Emma replied carefully. "It means we have jurisdiction," Jessica corrected, echoing Emma's words from the confrontation with Madison. "Madison's father might own half of Millbrook, but he doesn't own the federal government. At least, not yet." Emma appreciated Jessica's quick grasp of the implications, but she also felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Using her family connections wasn't something she took lightly, and it certainly wasn't something she could do casually or recklessly. "Before we get too far ahead of ourselves," Emma said, "you need to understand what we'd be getting into. Federal investigations are serious business. Once we start this process, there's no calling it back. Everything gets scrutinized, everyone gets interviewed, and the consequences are real." Jessica's expression sobered, but her resolve didn't waver. "Emma, I've been documenting systematic criminal behavior for 2 years. I've watched Madison and her friends destroy people's lives while hiding behind Daddy's money and connections. If there's a chance to finally hold them accountable for what they've done, I'm willing to face whatever consequences come with that." Emma studied Jessica's face, seeing the determination there, but also something deeper. This wasn't just about justice for Jessica. It was personal. "Who did they hurt?" Emma asked quietly. "Someone close to you?" Jessica's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment the professional investigator facade slipped away, revealing the hurt underneath. "My younger brother Alex. He's a sophomore, and last year Madison's group decided he was too weird for their liking. He's on the autism spectrum, brilliant with computers but struggles socially." She pulled out her phone and showed Emma a photo of a boy who shared her dark hair and serious eyes, but whose smile held an innocence that reminded Emma why this fight mattered. They made his life hell for months, constantly mocking the way he talks, filming him during his meltdowns and posting the videos online, even going so far as to hack his social media accounts and post things that made him look dangerous. Emma felt her anger crystallizing into something cold and focused. "What happened?" He stopped talking. Completely. For 3 months he communicated only in writing, and even that was minimal. "My parents tried everything. Therapy, medication adjustments, even considered homeschooling. But Alex was convinced that if he just stayed quiet enough, invisible enough, they'd forget about him and move on to someone else." Jessica's voice was steady now, but Emma could see the controlled fury in her eyes. "That's when I started investigating them seriously." I realized that what happened to Alex wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. They deliberately target students who are different, vulnerable, or who don't have the social capital to fight back. Emma understood now why Jessica had been so methodical in her investigation, so determined to build an airtight case. This wasn't just about journalism or justice. It was about protecting her brother and preventing other families from going through what hers had experienced. "How is Alex now?" Emma asked. "Better. He's talking again, though he's still cautious around most people. He's been working with our school counselor and has found a small group of friends who appreciate his interests. But he's still afraid of Madison and her friends. He takes longer routes to classes to avoid them, eats lunch in the computer lab instead of the cafeteria." Jessica's jaw tightened. He shouldn't have to live in fear at his own school. Emma felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. She'd always had a strong sense of justice, inherited from her mother's career and values. But this felt more immediate, more personal. Maybe it was because she understood what it felt like to be the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit in. Or maybe it was because she could see so clearly how Madison's cruelty was designed to destroy exactly the kind of unique, sensitive people who made the world more interesting. "Okay," Emma said, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "Let's bring them down." Jessica's smile was fierce and grateful. "What do we need to do?" Emma began organizing the documents Jessica had spread across the table. Her mind already working through the process her mother had taught her about building federal cases. "First, we need to establish clear evidence of crimes that fall under federal jurisdiction. The cyberbullying and harassment campaigns, especially the ones that targeted students across state lines through social media platforms, could qualify as interstate crimes." She pulled out a stack of printed screenshots showing the coordinated harassment of Sarah Martinez. These social media attacks were posted on platforms that operate across state lines, and they were designed to cause emotional distress and interfere with Sarah's education. That's potentially a federal crime under several statutes. Jessica nodded, taking notes. "What about the academic fraud?" "That's trickier," Emma admitted. "Academic fraud at the high school level isn't typically federal unless it involves federal funding or programs. But if Madison's cheating operation extends to standardized tests like the SATs or AP exams, that could bring it under federal jurisdiction, since those tests are administered nationally." Emma paused, remembering something from Madison's confident demeanor during their confrontation. "Actually, let me ask you something. Has Madison ever talked about college applications, standardized test scores, anything like that?" Jessica's eyes lit up with understanding. "Oh, you're gonna love this. Madison's been bragging all year about her perfect SAT score. The thing is, I know for a fact that she's failed multiple practice tests in our SAT prep class. Her math skills are barely adequate, and her reading comprehension is mediocre at best." Emma felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. Test fraud on national standardized exams is definitely a federal crime. If Madison's perfect score was obtained through cheating, that's mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud an educational institution. "I might be able to help you prove that," Jessica said, her excitement growing. "Alex is a computer genius, and he's been helping me with some of the digital investigation work. If Madison's score was artificially inflated, there should be data trails, digital footprints that show the fraud." Emma felt a moment of concern. "Jessica, I need you to be very careful about how we gather evidence. If Alex is involved in any computer-related investigation, everything he does has to be completely legal. We can't afford to have any evidence thrown out because it was obtained improperly." "Understood. Alex knows the rules. He's actually the one who taught me about proper digital evidence collection. He wants to go into cybersecurity, so he's very careful about staying on the right side of the law." Emma was beginning to see how this investigation might unfold. Jessica and Alex had already done much of the groundwork, but with federal resources and proper oversight, they could build a case that would be impossible for Madison's father to make disappear. "Here's what we need to do," Emma said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd learned from watching her mother manage complex operations. "We need to document everything from this point forward with absolute precision. Every interaction with Madison's group, every piece of evidence we collect, every witness we interview, it all has to be done by the book." She pulled out her phone and opened a secure note-taking app her mother had installed. I'm going to reach out to some contacts at the Bureau who specialize in cybercrime and education fraud. Not officially, not yet, but to get advice on how to properly document evidence for a potential federal case. Jessica was writing furiously, trying to keep up with Emma's planning. What about the local law enforcement? Madison's father has connections with the police chief, but if we're building a federal case, do we need to worry about local interference? Good question. Local law enforcement could be a problem if they try to interfere with our investigation or tip off Madison's family about what we're doing. We'll need to be very careful about who we trust and how much information we share. Emma paused, considering the complications. Actually, the fact that there's potential corruption or interference from local authorities could strengthen our federal case. The FBI takes jurisdictional interference very seriously. As they continued planning, Emma felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex problem beginning to take shape as a solvable puzzle. This was the kind of strategic thinking she'd grown up around, the methodical approach to gathering evidence and building cases that her mother's career had made routine dinner-table conversation. But there was also something deeply personal about this investigation that went beyond her usual appreciation for justice and order. Madison Clark represented everything Emma had learned to despise. The abuse of privilege, the targeting of the vulnerable, the assumption that wealth and connections could insulate someone from consequences. Taking down Madison's operation wouldn't just be about enforcing the law. It would be about proving that some principles were more powerful than money or local influence. There's something else we need to consider, Emma said, looking up from her notes. Madison's going to escalate. Yesterday's confrontation was just the opening move, and my refusal to back down will be seen as a direct challenge to her authority. She's going to come at me harder, and probably sooner rather than later. Jessica nodded grimly. I've seen her pattern. When someone resists her initial intimidation, she tends to get more creative and more vicious. The question is what form that escalation will take. Then we need to be ready for it, Emma said. In fact, we might be able to use her escalation against her. If she commits additional crimes while we're documenting her behavior, it just strengthens our case. Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking through the tactical implications. Madison's need to maintain dominance would drive her to take increasingly desperate measures, as Emma continued to resist her authority. That desperation could lead to mistakes, to evidence, to the kind of dramatic overreach that would make a federal case irresistible. I'm going to need to provoke her, Emma realized aloud. Not in a way that puts anyone else at risk, but enough to keep the pressure on and force her to show her true nature. Jessica looked concerned. That could be dangerous. Madison's group doesn't just do social ostracism, they've been known to get physical when they feel cornered. Then we'll make sure everything is documented, Emma said simply. If Madison or her friends assault me, that's evidence. If they threaten me, that's evidence. If they try to frame me for something, that's evidence too. Emma was beginning to see the full shape of what they were planning, and it was bigger than just exposing Madison's crimes. They were going to systematically dismantle an entire network of corruption and abuse that had been operating with impunity for years. The investigation would send a message that federal law applied to everyone, regardless of how much money their parents had or how many local officials they'd bought. There's one more thing, Emma said, her voice growing serious. Once we start this process, there's no going back for any of us. Madison's father won't just try to discredit the evidence. He'll try to destroy everyone involved in the investigation. That means you, me, Alex, and anyone else who helps us. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential retaliation? Jessica didn't hesitate. Emma, they've already tried to destroy my brother. They've made dozens of other students' lives miserable, and they're going to keep doing it until someone stops them. If there's a chance to end this, I'm willing to take whatever risks come with that. Emma felt a surge of respect for Jessica's courage and determination. Here was someone who understood that fighting injustice often required personal sacrifice, but who was willing to pay that price to protect others. It was the kind of principled courage Emma's mother had taught her to admire and emulate. All right then, Emma said, beginning to pack up the documents. Let's start with a formal evidence inventory. Everything you've collected so far needs to be properly cataloged and secured. Then we'll begin systematic documentation of any new incidents. As they organized the materials, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood run cold. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakably threatening. "Stop asking questions, or you'll find out why smart girls shouldn't try to be heroes." Emma showed the message to Jessica, who went pale. "That was fast," Jessica whispered. "How did they even get your number?" Emma was already thinking through the implications. The message meant that Madison's group knew about her investigation, which suggested they were either monitoring her communications or had someone feeding them information. Either possibility was deeply concerning. "This is actually good news," Emma said, surprising Jessica with her calm reaction. "How is a threat good news?" Emma smiled grimly as she screenshot the message and saved it to her secure evidence folder. Because threatening a federal agent's family member is a serious federal crime, and because it proves they're scared enough to take risks. She looked at Jessica with a new intensity. They just escalated this from a local investigation to a matter of national security. Madison Clark has no idea what she just stepped into, but she's about to find out that some people have resources she never imagined. As they left the library together, Emma felt the familiar calm that came with moving from planning to action. The investigation was no longer theoretical. It was active, and their opponents had just made their first major mistake. Emma spent the evening in her room, working on her laptop while soft jazz played in the background. Her mother was still at work, a late meeting with Homeland Security that would probably run past midnight, but Emma had left her a carefully worded message asking for advice on a hypothetical situation involving cyberbullying and potential federal crimes. Director Maria Rodriguez had always encouraged Emma to think through complex problems independently, but she'd also taught her to recognize when a situation required professional consultation. This qualified on multiple levels. Emma was creating a secure digital archive of Jessica's evidence when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her mother's personal cell phone, which meant she was calling from a secure location. "Hi, Mom," Emma answered, keeping her voice casual in case anyone was listening. "Emma, I got your message about the hypothetical situation. I have a few minutes between meetings. Why don't you walk me through the details?" Emma had learned years ago that when her mother used that particular tone, she wasn't really asking for hypothetical analysis. She was conducting a preliminary interview, gathering information to assess whether a situation required official attention. "Well, hypothetically," Emma began, falling into the familiar rhythm of briefing her mother on complex situations, "imagine a high school student who's been systematically harassing other students using social media platforms, coordinating with a group to target vulnerable individuals across state lines, and potentially engaging in standardized test fraud." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's quite a specific hypothetical, sweetheart." "And the local authorities?" "Hypothetically compromised by family connections and financial influence." Another pause, longer this time. Emma could practically hear her mother's analytical mind working through the jurisdictional and evidentiary implications. "Emma," her mother's voice was careful now, "this wouldn't happen to involve your current school situation, would it?" Emma had known this moment would come. Her mother was too perceptive and too experienced to miss the implications of Emma's questions. "It might be related to some things I've observed since starting at Oakwood." "I see. And you're not planning to do anything dangerous or legally questionable to address these observations, are you?" "I'm planning to document everything properly and work within appropriate legal channels," Emma replied, which was the truth, even if it wasn't the complete truth. She could hear her mother typing in the background, probably taking notes or looking up relevant statutes. "Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. If you've stumbled onto actual federal crimes, that's serious business. It's not something you should try to handle on your own, no matter how well prepared you think you are." "I understand, Mom. But what if the local situation is too compromised for normal reporting channels to be effective?" The typing stopped. "Then you call me directly, and we handle it through proper federal channels." "Emma, I mean this. If you're dealing with systematic harassment, fraud, or any kind of organized criminal activity, you need professional help. These aren't the kind of people you want to make enemies of without proper protection." Emma felt a chill at her mother's serious tone. Director Rodriguez had dealt with enough dangerous criminals to recognize when a situation had the potential to become genuinely threatening. What if documenting their activities puts other people at risk? Emma asked. Then we have a responsibility to protect those people and stop the criminal activity. But Emma, and I cannot stress this enough, that we means federal agents with proper training and authority, not high school students, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned they might be. Emma understood the message. Her mother was telling her that if this investigation was real, it needed to be handled professionally. But she was also implicitly acknowledging that Emma had identified something that merited federal attention. Hypothetically, Emma said carefully, what would be the best way to document evidence of these activities to ensure it would be usable in a federal investigation? The question seemed to confirm something for her mother, because her tone shifted slightly, becoming more instructional. Hypothetically, you'd want to avoid any activities that could be construed as entrapment or illegal surveillance. Everything would need to be obtained through legal means: public information, voluntary statements, evidence of crimes committed in your presence. Emma was taking notes now, recognizing that her mother was giving her a masterclass in evidence collection. What about digital evidence? Tricky. Screenshots of public social media posts are generally admissible, but anything that requires accessing private accounts or communications without permission would be problematic. The key is to make sure everything you collect could have been obtained by any member of the public. They talked for another 10 minutes, with her mother providing guidance on federal criminal statutes, evidence preservation, and witness protection. By the end of the conversation, Emma had a clear understanding of how to proceed with the investigation while ensuring that everything they collected would be legally admissible. Emma, her mother said as they prepared to end the call, I want you to promise me something. If this situation escalates, if you feel threatened in any way, or if you uncover evidence of serious crimes, you'll contact me immediately. Not because I don't trust your judgment, but because some things are too dangerous to handle alone. I promise, Mom. Good. And Emma, be careful. People who are willing to systematically destroy other people's lives for entertainment or power are capable of more than you might expect. After they hung up, Emma sat in her room thinking about her mother's warnings. Director Rodriguez had seen enough criminal operations to recognize the patterns, and her concern suggested that Madison's activities might be more serious than even Emma had initially realized. Emma opened her laptop and began creating a systematic evidence log, using the protocols her mother had outlined. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the message she'd received earlier, about the implicit threat and what it suggested about Madison's resources and willingness to escalate. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Jessica. Alex found something interesting in Madison's social media metadata. Can we meet tomorrow before school? Emma typed back quickly. Yes, and Jessica, we need to be more careful about communications from now on. Assume everything is being monitored. She sent the message and then immediately opened her phone's security settings, enabling additional encryption and privacy features her mother had installed. If Madison's group was sophisticated enough to obtain her phone number and send threatening messages, they might be capable of more invasive surveillance. As Emma prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the escalating nature of their conflict. Madison had made her opening move with the cafeteria confrontation, Emma had responded by refusing to be intimidated, and now Madison was raising the stakes with direct threats. Each escalation brought them closer to the kind of serious criminal activity that would justify federal intervention, but it also increased the danger to everyone involved. Emma turned off her lights and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her quiet Connecticut neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Madison Clark was probably planning her next move, confident that her father's money and connections would protect her from any consequences. She had no idea that she was about to face an opponent with access to resources that existed far beyond the reach of local corruption. The thought made Emma smile as she drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new evidence, and probably new threats. But for the first time since arriving at Oakwood High School, Emma Rodriguez felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Justice, as her mother had taught her, wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And Madison Clark was about to learn that some people took that responsibility very seriously indeed. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of Connecticut autumn weather that made everything feel muted and expectant. Emma arrived at school early, using her student ID to access the building before most students or faculty had arrived. She'd arranged to meet Jessica in the computer lab, where Alex spent most of his free time, and where they could talk without drawing unwanted attention. Emma found them huddled around a computer terminal in the far corner of the lab, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of multiple monitors. Alex Park looked even younger than his 15 years, with his sister's serious dark eyes but a nervous energy that spoke of brilliant minds working overtime. When Emma approached, he looked up with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Alex, this is Emma Rodriguez," Jessica said quietly. "The one I told you about." Alex studied Emma's face for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression that he was cataloging details and making rapid assessments. Finally, he nodded once, a gesture that seemed to indicate provisional acceptance. "Show her what you found," Jessica encouraged. Alex turned back to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I've been analyzing Madison Clark's digital footprint for the past 6 months," he said, his voice soft but precise. "Not hacking or anything illegal, just collecting and analyzing publicly available data." The screen filled with what looked like a complex data visualization, showing connections between social media accounts, posting patterns, and metadata analysis. Emma was impressed by the sophistication of the display. This wasn't amateur hour detective work. Madison's social media presence shows several interesting anomalies, Alex continued, highlighting different sections of his analysis. First, her posting patterns during the period when she supposedly took the SAT show her being active on multiple platforms at the exact time the test was being administered. Emma leaned in closer, studying the timestamps Alex had highlighted. She was posting selfies during the SAT. "Not just posting," Alex said, bringing up another screen. She was engaging in lengthy text conversations, playing mobile games, and even live-streaming parts of her morning routine. All activities that would be impossible if she was actually sitting in a testing center taking a 4-hour exam. Jessica was taking notes, documenting everything Alex showed them. "Tell her about the location data." Alex nodded, pulling up a map overlay. "This is where it gets really interesting. Madison's phone's location data, extracted from the metadata of her social media posts, shows her at a private facility in Hartford on the morning she supposedly took the SAT at Oakwood High. The facility is registered as Academic Excellence Solutions and appears to be some kind of private testing service." Emma felt pieces clicking together in her mind. A private testing service that allows students to take standardized tests in controlled environments with accommodations. "Exactly," Alex said, his excitement growing as he realized Emma understood the implications. "But here's the thing. Madison doesn't have any documented learning disabilities or conditions that would qualify her for special testing accommodations. I checked the school's records that are publicly available through FOIA requests." Emma was beginning to see the full scope of what Alex had uncovered. So Madison took her SAT at a private facility, where the testing conditions could be manipulated, while her social media activity proves she wasn't actually taking the test herself. "It gets better," Jessica said, clearly proud of her brother's detective work. Alex found evidence that at least 6 other students from wealthy Millbrook families have used the same private testing facility, all of whom showed similar, impossible social media activity during their supposed test dates. Alex brought up profiles for the other students, showing the same patterns of digital activity during testing periods. This suggests an organized operation, not just individual cheating. Someone is systematically facilitating standardized test fraud for wealthy students, and Madison's perfect score is just one example. Emma felt the familiar satisfaction of watching a criminal case come together. This wasn't just high school bullying anymore. This was organized fraud involving standardized tests that were used for college admissions nationwide. The jurisdictional implications were clear, and the evidence was compelling. "Alex, this is incredible work," Emma said, and she meant it. "But I need to ask, how did you access some of this data? We need to make sure everything you've collected is legally admissible." Alex's expression grew more serious. "I was very careful about that. Everything I've shown you is either publicly available information or data that can be legally obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. I didn't hack anything or access any private systems." "What about the location metadata from social media posts?" all extracted from publicly visible posts using standard analysis tools. When people post on social media with location services enabled, that metadata becomes part of the public record. I just aggregated and analyzed it systematically. Emma nodded, impressed by Alex's understanding of legal evidence collection. Have you documented your methodology? If this becomes part of a federal investigation, we'll need to show exactly how each piece of evidence was obtained. I've got detailed logs of everything, Alex said, opening another file that showed timestamps, sources, and methods for each piece of data. Jessica taught me about proper documentation when I started helping with her investigation. Emma was beginning to understand why Jessica had been so confident about building a case against Madison's operation. With Alex's technical skills and Jessica's investigative methodology, they'd assembled evidence that would be difficult to discredit or dismiss. There's something else, Jessica said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Alex found communications between Madison and someone at Academic Excellence Solutions, not private messages but public comments on social media that suggest coordination. Alex brought up screenshots of Instagram comments on posts by Academic Excellence Solutions. In several instances, Madison had commented with what appeared to be coded language, references to excellence achieved, and solutions delivered that seemed to go beyond normal student testimonials. These comments were posted on dates that correspond to other students' testing periods, Alex explained. It looks like Madison might be acting as a recruiter or coordinator for the testing fraud operation. Emma felt her pulse quicken. If Madison was actively recruiting other students for the fraud scheme, that elevated her role from victim to conspirator in an ongoing criminal enterprise. It also suggested that bringing down Madison might expose a much larger operation. We need to be very careful about how we proceed with this information, Emma said, thinking through the implications. If Madison is part of a larger fraud network, the people running it have significant resources and motivation to protect their operation. As if summoned by her words, Emma's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. This one was more specific than the previous threat. Stop digging or your new friends will face consequences. Some students have accidents. Emma showed the message to Jessica and Alex, watching their faces pale as they read it. The threat was no longer directed just at Emma. It was targeting Jessica and Alex as well. That's it, Emma said, her voice hard with determination. They just threatened federal witnesses in an ongoing investigation. Time to make this official. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago but had never needed to use. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Director Rodriguez. Mom, it's Emma. I need to invoke Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was a family code they'd established years ago, a way for Emma to signal that she'd encountered a situation requiring immediate federal intervention. It was designed for emergencies where Emma might be in danger or had witnessed serious federal crimes. There was a brief pause. Are you safe right now? Yes, but I have evidence of organized criminal activity, and I've received credible threats. I'm with witnesses who can corroborate federal crimes. Stay where you are. I'm dispatching agents to your location immediately. Don't discuss this with anyone else, don't leave the school, and don't engage with any suspects. Do you understand? Yes, Mom. Emma, I'm proud of you for recognizing when you needed help. Agents will be there within 30 minutes. After hanging up, Emma turned to Jessica and Alex, who were staring at her with wide eyes. Federal agents are on their way. This is no longer a student investigation. It's an official federal case. Alex looked terrified. Are we in trouble? No, Emma said firmly. You're witnesses who uncovered evidence of federal crimes. The FBI protects witnesses, especially ones who've helped build cases against criminal operations. Jessica was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what was happening. What happens to Madison and her friends? That depends on what the investigation uncovers, Emma replied. But based on the evidence you've collected, they're looking at serious federal charges. Test fraud, conspiracy, potentially racketeering if this operation is as extensive as it appears. Emma's phone rang again, this time with a call from an unknown local number. She answered cautiously. Emma Rodriguez? The voice was male, older, with the kind of authority that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed. Who is this? This is Councilman David Clark, Madison's father. I think we need to have a conversation. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Madison's father, calling her directly, suggested that their investigation had touched a nerve at the highest levels of Millbrook's power structure. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Mr. Clark. Oh, I think we do. You see, I've been hearing some very interesting stories about a new student who's been asking inappropriate questions and making serious accusations against outstanding members of our community. Emma activated her phone's recording feature, a function her mother had installed for exactly these kinds of situations. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I think you know exactly what I'm referring to, Miss Rodriguez, and I think you should know that making false accusations against prominent families can have serious consequences. Legal consequences. Financial consequences. The kind of consequences that follow you for the rest of your life. The threat was clear, but Councilman Clark had just made a crucial mistake. Threatening a federal agent's family member was a serious crime, and threatening witnesses in a federal investigation was even worse. Is that a threat, Mr. Clark? It's a statement of fact. Millbrook is a small community, and we protect our own. People who try to damage our reputation or harm our children tend to find that this isn't a comfortable place for them to live. Emma looked at Jessica and Alex, who were listening to the conversation with growing alarm. She made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. Mr. Clark, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded, and you are currently threatening federal witnesses in an ongoing FBI investigation. I suggest you contact your attorney immediately. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several long moments. When Councilman Clark finally spoke, his voice had lost its confident authority. What did you say? I said you're threatening federal witnesses. My name is Emma Rodriguez, my mother is FBI Director Maria Rodriguez, and you just confessed to obstruction of justice on a recorded line. Emma could hear Councilman Clark's breathing become labored. That's impossible. Maria Rodriguez doesn't have children. She does, Emma said calmly. And one of them just spent the last 3 weeks documenting federal crimes committed by your daughter and her associates. Crimes that you apparently have knowledge of, based on your threats. The line went dead. Emma looked at her phone and saw that Councilman Clark had hung up, probably to call his lawyers and figure out how much trouble he was in. Did that really just happen? Jessica whispered. It really just happened, Emma confirmed. And it means we're about to see how far this corruption network extends. 20 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled into the Oakwood High School parking lot. Emma watched from the computer lab window as federal agents in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, moving with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested they were taking this operation very seriously. Emma's phone rang with a call from her mother. Emma, are you still in the computer lab? Yes, with Jessica and Alex Park. Agent Martinez will be coming to escort you to a secure location for interviews. The school is being locked down while we execute search warrants. Emma looked out the window again and saw more vehicles arriving, local police cars, but also what appeared to be federal marshals and additional FBI units. This wasn't just an investigation anymore, it was a full-scale operation. Mom, how big is this going to get? Bigger than you probably imagined, sweetheart. The evidence you and your friends uncovered has connections to a multi-state academic fraud network we've been investigating for months. You may have just helped us crack open an operation that's been defrauding colleges and universities across the country. Emma felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. They'd succeeded in exposing Madison's crimes, but the scope of what they'd uncovered was larger than any of them had anticipated. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway of the computer lab, a professional-looking woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an authoritative presence. Emma Rodriguez? I'm Special Agent Martinez. I'll be coordinating your interview and ensuring your safety during this operation. As they prepared to leave the computer lab, Emma looked back at Alex, who was carefully shutting down his computers and securing his evidence files. Jessica was gathering her documentation, her face set with determination despite the obvious stress of the situation. Are you two okay with this? Emma asked quietly. Jessica nodded firmly. We started this to protect Alex and stop Madison from hurting other people. If that means testifying in federal court, then that's what we'll do. Alex looked up from his computer. Emma, will they really be held accountable? Madison and her friends, the people running the testing fraud, all of them? Yes, Emma said with certainty. Federal prosecutors don't mess around with organized fraud cases. If the evidence is as strong as what you've shown me, they're looking at serious prison time. As Agent Martinez led them out of the computer lab and through the hallways of Oakwood High School, Emma could see the chaos their investigation had unleashed. Students were being escorted to the gymnasium for questioning, teachers were huddled in nervous groups, and federal agents were systematically searching lockers and classrooms. Emma spotted Madison near her locker, surrounded by federal agents and looking smaller and more frightened than Emma had ever seen her. Their eyes met across the hallway, and for a moment Emma felt a flash of something that might have been pity. Madison had thought her father's money and connections made her untouchable, but she was learning that some authorities existed beyond the reach of local corruption. Connor Walsh was being led away in handcuffs, apparently having been caught with evidence of the testing fraud operation in his possession. Sophia Bennett was crying hysterically as agents confiscated her phone and laptop, her carefully curated social media empire crumbling as evidence of her harassment campaigns was systematically documented. Ryan Miller was sitting alone on a bench, talking quietly with an FBI agent who was clearly treating him as a witness rather than a suspect. Emma felt a surge of hope that Ryan would finally be free from the fear that had controlled his life for so long. As they reached the school's main entrance, Emma saw her mother's familiar figure standing beside one of the black SUVs. Director Maria Rodriguez was in full professional mode, coordinating with other federal agents and local law enforcement, but when she saw Emma, her expression softened with relief and pride. "Mom," Emma said, walking over to her. "You did good work, sweetheart," Director Rodriguez said, pulling Emma into a brief hug. "Dangerous work, but good work. The evidence you and your friends collected is going to put a lot of bad people in prison." Emma looked back at Oakwood High School, where federal agents were still conducting their operation. "What happens now? Now we build cases, conduct trials, and make sure that everyone involved faces appropriate consequences," her mother replied. "And you go back to being a normal high school student because your part in this investigation is over." Emma smiled, thinking about how different Oakwood High School was going to be when classes resumed. Madison's reign of terror was over. The corruption network that had protected her was exposed, and students like Alex Park would finally be safe to be themselves without fear of retaliation. "Actually, Mom, I think I'm looking forward to being a normal student here. For the first time since we moved to Millbrook, I think Oakwood might actually be a decent place to go to school." Director Rodriguez smiled, the expression transforming her authoritative face into something warm and proud. "Well, you certainly made sure of that. Come on, let's get you home. You've had enough excitement for one semester." As they drove away from Oakwood High School, Emma thought about justice and consequences, about the difference between local influence and federal authority, and about the satisfaction that came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Madison Clark had learned that some people's resources extended far beyond small-town corruption networks. Emma Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the best way to fit into a new school was to completely change what that school represented. 6 months later, Emma sat in the same spot in the Oakwood High School cafeteria where Madison Clark had once held court. But now, instead of intimidation and fear, the atmosphere was one of genuine community and acceptance. Alex Park sat at a nearby table with a group of friends, animatedly discussing a computer programming project, his earlier trauma replaced by confidence and enthusiasm. Jessica had won a national award for investigative journalism for her documentation of the academic fraud network, and her articles had led to reforms in standardized testing security protocols nationwide. She'd also been accepted to Columbia University's journalism program with a full scholarship. Madison Clark was serving her sentence at a federal youth detention facility, having been convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, and cyberbullying that crossed state lines. Her father's political career had ended in disgrace, and his business empire had collapsed under federal investigation. Connor Walsh had received a lighter sentence in exchange for testifying against the broader fraud network, and Sophia Bennett was serving community service while attending court-mandated counseling for her role in the harassment campaigns. Ryan Miller had transferred to a private school in Hartford, where he was reportedly thriving in an environment free from fear and manipulation. Emma looked around the cafeteria, watching students who were no longer afraid to be different, no longer terrorized by systematic bullying, no longer living under the shadow of corruption and abuse. She'd come to Oakwood High School looking for a fresh start, and she'd found something better, the opportunity to create fresh starts for dozens of other people. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Proud of you every day. How's the normal high school experience treating you?" Emma typed back. "Turns out normal is pretty amazing when it's actually fair." She put her phone away and returned to her chemistry homework, smiling to herself as she calculated molecular equations and thought about justice, jurisdiction, and the satisfaction that came from knowing that sometimes the good guys really did win. 3 weeks had passed since the federal operation at Oakwood High School, and the ripple effects were still being felt throughout Millbrook. Emma sat in the witness preparation room at the Hartford Federal Building, reviewing her testimony one final time before the grand jury proceedings that would determine the formal charges against Madison Clark and her co-conspirators. Special Agent Martinez had become a familiar presence in Emma's life over the past few weeks, coordinating witness interviews and ensuring that Emma, Jessica, and Alex were protected from any potential retaliation. The agent's calm professionalism had helped ease the stress of being thrust into the center of a major federal investigation. "The grand jury will want to hear about your direct interactions with Madison Clark," Agent Martinez explained, consulting her notes. "Focus on specific incidents, exact words when you remember them, and your observations about the systematic nature of her harassment campaigns." Emma nodded, her mind already organizing the sequence of events that had led them to this moment. It felt surreal to think that what had started as typical high school bullying had evolved into a federal racketeering case with implications that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. "What's the latest on the broader investigation?" Emma asked. Agent Martinez smiled grimly. "Academic Excellence Solutions was a front for a multi-state operation that's been facilitating standardized test fraud for wealthy families across New England. Your friend Alex's digital forensics work helped us identify at least 47 students from 6 different states who used their services over the past 3 years." Emma felt a surge of pride for Alex's contribution to the case. His meticulous documentation and technical expertise had transformed a local bullying investigation into a landmark federal case that would reshape standardized testing security nationwide. "The financial records we seized from Councilman Clark's office have been particularly illuminating," Agent Martinez continued. "He wasn't just protecting his daughter's crimes. He was financially invested in the testing fraud operation. We're looking at money laundering charges, in addition to obstruction of justice and witness intimidation." Emma thought about the phone call from Madison's father, how his arrogant threats had revealed far more than he'd intended. That single conversation, recorded on Emma's phone, had provided prosecutors with evidence of corruption at the highest levels of Millbrook's government. "Have you been able to identify all the victims of Madison's harassment campaigns?" Quote, Emma asked. "We're still working on that. Jessica's documentation has been invaluable, but we suspect there are students who suffered in silence and never reported what happened to them. We've set up a confidential hotline for anyone who wants to come forward." Agent Martinez paused, studying Emma's face. "I want you to know that the Bureau considers your actions in this case to be exemplary. You showed remarkable judgment in recognizing when to escalate the situation to federal authorities, and your evidence collection was textbook perfect." Emma felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the praise, but also a sobering awareness of how easily things could have gone wrong. "I had good training," she said, thinking of her mother's guidance and the family discussions about justice and responsibility that had shaped her worldview. "Your mother is very proud," Agent Martinez said, "but she's also concerned about the attention this case is going to bring to your family. High-profile federal cases tend to generate media interest, and the fact that you're the FBI director's daughter adds another layer of complexity." Emma had been thinking about that aspect of the situation as well. Once the case went to trial, their family's privacy would be compromised in ways that could have lasting implications for her mother's career and their personal safety. "We've discussed it," Emma said. "Mom thinks the benefits of prosecuting this case outweigh the personal costs. She says that if federal officials' families can't seek justice when they're victims of crimes, then the system doesn't work for anyone." Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. "Director Rodriguez has a reputation for principled decision-making. This case is going to set important precedents for how federal authorities handle systematic cyberbullying and academic fraud." Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Grand jury testimony went well. Alex was amazing. The prosecutors were blown away by his technical presentation." feeling hopeful about justice finally being served. Emma smiled, thinking about how much Jessica and Alex had grown during this ordeal. They'd started as victims and witnesses, but they'd evolved into advocates for systemic change. Jessica's journalism had already sparked conversations about bullying prevention in schools across Connecticut, while Alex's technical expertise had led to consulting opportunities with cybersecurity firms interested in his digital forensics methods. "There's something else we need to discuss," Agent Martinez said, her tone becoming more serious. "The defense attorneys for Madison and her co-conspirators are going to try to discredit your testimony by suggesting that you orchestrated this entire situation to gain attention or advance your mother's career." Emma felt a flash of anger at the suggestion, but she understood that it was a predictable defense strategy. How do we counter that argument? With facts and evidence. The timeline clearly shows that Madison's harassment campaigns began before you enrolled at Oakwood High School. Your initial attempts to avoid confrontation are well documented. And most importantly, the evidence of criminal activity was discovered through legitimate investigation, not manufactured for political purposes. Agent Martinez pulled out a folder containing witness statements and documentary evidence. "We have testimony from dozens of current and former Oakwood students about Madison's behavior patterns going back years. We have financial records proving the academic fraud operation existed independently of your enrollment. And we have digital evidence that can't be faked or manipulated." Emma reviewed some of the witness statements, reading accounts from students who had been terrorized by Madison's group long before Emma had arrived in Millbrook. The stories were heartbreaking, tales of systematic psychological torture that had driven vulnerable teenagers to desperation and despair. "Sarah Martinez agreed to testify," Agent Martinez said quietly, "the girl who attempted self-harm after Madison's harassment campaign. Her testimony is going to be powerful, but it's also going to be difficult for everyone involved." Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These weren't just legal proceedings. They were opportunities for victims to finally be heard, to have their experiences validated by a system that had previously ignored their suffering. "I want to make sure I do this right," Emma said. "These people deserve justice, and they deserve to have their stories told accurately." "You will," Agent Martinez assured her. "Your preparation has been thorough, and your commitment to truth is evident. Just remember to stick to the facts, speak clearly, and trust that the evidence will speak for itself." Quote, Emma spent the next hour reviewing her notes and preparing for questions the grand jury might ask. Agent Martinez had provided her with a comprehensive briefing on federal grand jury procedures, including the types of questions prosecutors typically asked, and the standards of evidence required for indictments. As they wrapped up their preparation session, Emma's phone rang with a call from her mother. Director Rodriguez had been careful to maintain professional boundaries during the investigation, but as the case moved toward formal prosecution, she'd been more involved in coordinating security and witness protection measures. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" her mother asked. "Ready," Emma replied. "Agent Martinez has been great about preparing me for what to expect. I'm going to be in Hartford tomorrow for other meetings, but I won't be anywhere near the grand jury proceedings. We need to maintain clear separation between my official duties and your role as a witness." Emma understood the necessity of keeping their professional and personal relationships distinct during the legal process. Her mother's reputation for integrity was too important to risk any appearance of impropriety, even in a case where Emma was clearly the victim of criminal activity. "Mom, do you think we did the right thing? Taking this to federal court, I mean. The consequences for Madison and her friends are going to be severe." There was a pause before her mother responded. "Emma, federal prosecution isn't about revenge, it's about justice and prevention. Madison Clark and her associates committed serious crimes that harmed multiple victims over several years. If we don't hold them accountable, they'll continue hurting people, and other predators will assume they can operate with impunity." Emma felt the truth of those words settling in her mind. This case wasn't just about punishment for past crimes. It was about creating a deterrent effect that would protect future victims. "Besides," her mother continued, "the evidence suggests that Madison's operation was escalating. The threats against you and your friends, the coordination with adult conspirators, the financial aspects of the fraud scheme, these weren't the actions of teenagers making bad decisions. This was organized criminal activity that required federal intervention." After ending the call with her mother, Emma walked through downtown Hartford, thinking about the transformation that had occurred in her life over the past month. She'd arrived at Oakwood High School as a transfer student, hoping to blend in and avoid attention. Instead, she'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy and become a key witness in a federal racketeering case. The irony wasn't lost on her that, in trying to remain invisible, she'd ended up at the center of one of the most high-profile cases in Connecticut's recent legal history. But Emma was beginning to understand that some things were more important than personal comfort or anonymity. The next morning, Emma arrived at the federal courthouse accompanied by Agent Martinez and a security detail that her mother had insisted upon. The media attention had been intense, with reporters from major news outlets covering the case as an example of cyberbullying prosecution and academic fraud enforcement. Emma had been coached on how to handle media questions, brief, factual responses that didn't compromise the ongoing investigation or legal proceedings. She'd also been advised to avoid any statements that could be construed as vindictive or personally motivated. The grand jury room was smaller than Emma had expected, with 23 citizens seated in a semicircle facing the witness chair. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and an authoritative presence that reminded Emma of her mother. "Miss Rodriguez," ADA Walsh began, "please state your full name and your relationship to the defendant Madison Clark." "My name is Emma Maria Rodriguez." Madison Clark was a student at Oakwood High School, where I was enrolled as a junior. We had no relationship prior to my enrollment at the school. "Can you describe your first interaction with Madison Clark?" Emma took a deep breath and began recounting the cafeteria confrontation that had started everything. She spoke clearly and factually, describing Madison's words and actions without editorial commentary or emotional interpretation. The grand jurors listened intently as Emma detailed the systematic nature of Madison's harassment campaigns, the involvement of her co-conspirators, and the discovery of the academic fraud operation. Several jurors took notes, and Emma could see their expressions growing more serious as the scope of the criminal activity became clear. "Miss Rodriguez, did you ever attempt to resolve these conflicts through normal school disciplinary channels before contacting federal authorities?" "Yes," Emma replied. However, it became apparent that the local authorities were compromised by Madison's father's political connections. "When we received direct threats against our safety and evidence of ongoing federal crimes, escalation to federal authorities became necessary." Ada Walsh spent considerable time on the evidence collection process, establishing that Emma, Jessica, and Alex had followed proper legal procedures and had not engaged in any illegal surveillance or evidence gathering. The grand jurors seemed particularly interested in Alex's technical methods and the safeguards he'd used to ensure the admissibility of digital evidence. "Miss Rodriguez, what was your motivation for pursuing this investigation despite the personal risks involved?" Emma paused, thinking about how to articulate something that felt both deeply personal and universally important. Madison Clark and her associates were systematically destroying people's lives while hiding behind wealth and political connections. Students were being driven to self-harm, academic institutions were being defrauded, and vulnerable people were being targeted because they were different or defenseless. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several grand jurors. "I was raised to believe that when you witness injustice, you have a responsibility to act, not for revenge or personal gain, but because allowing criminal behavior to continue unchecked makes you complicit in the harm it causes." The questioning continued for another 2 hours, covering every aspect of Emma's involvement in the case. Ada Walsh was thorough, but respectful, clearly building a comprehensive record for the formal indictments that would follow. When Emma's testimony concluded, several grand jurors thanked her for her courage in coming forward. One elderly man, who'd been particularly attentive during her testimony, spoke directly to her as she prepared to leave. "Young lady, you've done something important here. My granddaughter was bullied at her school, and the administrators did nothing because the bully's family donated money to the district. Seeing you stand up for what's right gives me hope that things can change." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the man's words. This case had always been about more than Madison Clark or Oakwood High School. It was about establishing that wealth and connections couldn't insulate people from consequences when they chose to harm others. As Emma left the courthouse, she was approached by a reporter from the Hartford Courant who asked for her thoughts on the grand jury proceedings. "I can't comment on the specific testimony," Emma said, remembering her media training, "but I can say that I believe in the federal justice system's ability to hold people accountable regardless of their family's wealth or political connections. No one should be above the law." The reporter pressed for more details, but Emma politely declined and walked away with Agent Martinez. They discussed the importance of letting the legal process speak for itself, rather than trying the case in the media. 2 weeks later, the grand jury returned indictments against Madison Clark, Connor Walsh, Sophia Bennett, Councilman David Clark, and 6 other individuals connected to the academic fraud operation. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and violations of federal cyberbullying statutes. Emma read the indictment documents with a mixture of satisfaction and soberness. The legal language was clinical and precise, but behind each charge was a human story of pain, fear, and injustice that had finally been acknowledged by the system. Madison Clark was facing up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. Her father was looking at even more serious consequences, including potential forfeiture of his assets and permanent disbarment from holding public office. The case had attracted national attention, with legal experts praising it as a landmark prosecution that would establish important precedents for cyberbullying enforcement and academic fraud prevention. Several states had already announced plans to strengthen their own laws based on the Connecticut prosecution. Emma returned to Oakwood High School the following Monday, walking through hallways that felt completely different from the place she'd first encountered months earlier. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation had been replaced by something that felt genuinely supportive and inclusive. Ryan Miller had returned from his private school in Hartford, having decided that he wanted to finish his senior year at Oakwood. He approached Emma during lunch, his demeanor more confident and relaxed than she'd ever seen. "Emma, I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "I know I wasn't brave enough to stand up to Madison when it mattered, but watching you fight back gave me hope that things could change." Emma smiled at him. "You helped when it counted, Ryan. Your testimony to the FBI provided crucial corroboration for the conspiracy charges." "I heard Madison's pleading guilty to avoid trial," Ryan said. "Is that true?" "I can't discuss the details of plea negotiations," Emma replied, "but I can say that justice is being served, and that's what matters." Jessica joined them at lunch, carrying a letter that had arrived that morning. "It's from Sarah Martinez," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "She wanted to thank us for giving her the courage to testify. She says that having her story finally believed and validated has been transformative for her healing process." Emma felt a deep sense of completion at those words. The legal proceedings were important, but the real victory was in the lives that had been changed, the voices that had been heard, and the precedent that had been established for future victims. Alex appeared at their table, carrying his laptop and wearing a smile that transformed his serious face. "I got accepted to MIT's cybersecurity program," he announced. "Full scholarship, and they specifically mentioned my work on this case as demonstrating real-world application of digital forensics principles." Emma felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. Alex's brilliant mind and technical skills had been crucial to building their case, but more importantly, he'd found his confidence in his voice through the process of seeking justice. "What about you?" Jessica asked Emma. "Any thoughts about what comes next?" Emma looked around the cafeteria, watching students who were no longer afraid to be themselves, no longer terrorized by systematic bullying, no longer living under the shadow of corruption. She thought about justice and consequences, about the difference between local influence and federal authority, and about the satisfaction that came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. "I think I want to study law," Emma said. "Constitutional law, specifically. I want to understand how federal and state jurisdictions interact, how civil rights are protected, and how ordinary people can access justice even when local systems fail them." Jessica grinned. "Following in your mom's footsteps?" "Not exactly," Emma replied. "Mom enforces the law. I think I want to help people understand their rights under the law. There are too many people who suffer in silence because they don't know they have legal protections or don't understand how to access them." As the school day ended and Emma walked toward her mother's car in the pickup line, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd come to Oakwood High School looking for a fresh start and had found something much more significant: a calling, a purpose, and a deep understanding of what justice really meant. Her mother was waiting in the car, having taken time away from her demanding schedule to personally pick Emma up from school. It was a small gesture, but one that reminded Emma of the family values that had guided her through this difficult period. "How was your day?" Director Rodriguez asked as Emma settled into the passenger seat. "Good. Different. It feels like a completely different school than the one I started at." Her mother smiled. That's what happens when you remove systematic corruption and abuse from an environment. People can finally be themselves without fear. Emma thought about Madison Clark, who was probably spending her afternoons with lawyers and preparing for a very different future than she'd imagined months earlier. There was no satisfaction in Madison's downfall, but there was deep satisfaction in knowing that her victims were finally safe and heard. "Mom, do you think what we did will make a lasting difference?" Director Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Emma, landmark cases create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. This prosecution has already influenced policy discussions in Congress about cyberbullying enforcement. Several states are strengthening their academic fraud statutes. And most importantly, other victims of systematic harassment now know that the federal government will take their cases seriously." As they drove through Millbrook's tree-lined streets, Emma felt a profound sense of completion and purpose. She'd learned that sometimes the best way to fit into a new community was to work to make that community more just and inclusive for everyone. Madison Clark had thought her father's money and connections made her untouchable. She'd learned that some people's resources extended far beyond local corruption networks. Emma Rodriguez had learned that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a world where vulnerable people could live without fear, where different voices could be heard, and where systematic abuse couldn't hide behind wealth and privilege. 6 months later, Emma received a letter from Sarah Martinez, who was thriving at her new school and had started a peer counseling program for students who'd experienced bullying. Alex had begun his studies at MIT and was already working on research projects with federal cybersecurity agencies. Jessica had been accepted to Columbia's journalism program and was planning to specialize in investigative reporting on education policy and civil rights. Madison Clark had pled guilty to federal conspiracy charges and was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into academic fraud networks. Her father had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and had been permanently barred from holding public office. Emma opened her laptop and began working on her college application essays, writing about justice, jurisdiction, and the responsibility that comes with having access to resources and power. She was applying to law schools with strong constitutional law programs, planning to study the intersection of federal and state authority and the mechanisms that protected individual rights. As she wrote, Emma thought about the conversation she'd had with her mother about ripple effects and lasting change. The Oakwood High School case had become a model for federal prosecution of systematic cyberbullying, and the precedents it established were being used to protect victims across the country. But the most important change wasn't legal or institutional. It was personal. Emma had learned that standing up for justice required courage, preparation, and the willingness to face consequences. She'd also learned that when people with resources and access chose to use those advantages to protect others, the results could be transformative for entire communities. Emma finished her essay and closed her laptop, looking out her bedroom window at the peaceful Connecticut neighborhood that had become truly safe for everyone who lived there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she'd made a difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.